All right. So one of the things that was touched on in the keynote panel, just as far as the sites, where are we putting them, as far as, and then just the work that goes into it, and just kind of the logistics, and when you do put a charging site in, are people going to go to it? So we're going to talk a little bit more about that with these next gentlemen here. The panel, Site Installation Fundamentals. Glad you guys are here. Get situated, get comfy, and enjoy the show.
My name is Russ Clark, and I'm going to introduce our panel here, and we'll start with Brian down on the end.
Thanks. Brian Shaw. I oversee parking and transportation at Stanford University. We've got hundreds of charging stations on campus, as well as electric buses. So we've been in this space for a little while. And I'm not selling anything, and nor do I want to buy much when I'm here. So I'm pretty objective about this and looking forward to the conversation.
I'm Matt Horton. I'll be working Brian over afterward to buy some things. I'm with a company called Volterra. We're a relatively new company as a whole. We're in the charging infrastructure space, building out charging locations. We're in the business of finding great sites, providing the power to the sites, building out the energy assets on the sites, and then working with leading companies in the space that are in charging, either for their own fleets or for others. Like Brian, we've both been in and around this business a long time. I have most recently been with a company called Rivian. Some of you might know, where I led the energy and charging team. A bunch of my former teammates are here with me at Volterra, and time with heavy-duty fleets and some retail infrastructure as well before that. But excited to be here with everybody today.
Yeah, I'm John Ankervaya. I am the market segment leader at GPRS for our EV and our renewable energy strategy. And so we've been in the EV space for about 3.5 years, driving strategy and partnerships. And if you're not familiar with GPRS, we are the industry leader in infrastructure mapping, specifically on the utility locating and mapping side in the EV space. And our vision as a company is 100% subsurface damage prevention, and a lot of that's being driven by us, but it's also being driven by the folks in this room, as you guys are driving positive change and adoption in the private locating space. So we appreciate you being here.
My name is John Duran. I'm the president of Alacia Falls Hydropower, as well as Plug-in Stations Online. We are a full-service EV infrastructure company, and I'm actually proud to announce to all of you today that we just recently won the contract to convert all of the EGSE at JFK Airport over to electric. So we'll be looking at, saving all of that sort of carbon monoxide that heads into the building from all the EGSE being underneath. And we work with pantographs. We just converted the city of Buffalo, New York to electric. So I'm also, like I said earlier, on the distributed generation side with the hydropower plant. So if you have any questions about either, just let me know.
Thank you. My name is Russ Clark, and my business works primarily on the front end of the EV charging site. We do a lot of the due diligence, surveying, and mapping of sites on the front. We've been working in this sector since 2012, so I've been doing it for a little bit of while. But I would like to begin with, since we're on site installation fundamentals, is I'd like to talk a little bit about the due diligence process of bringing an EV charger site online. So, Brian, you have some experience in adding chargers to Stanford University, so what are your thoughts on this?
Well, this is probably about 8 years ago. We were at a pivot point in terms of how much EV charging do we want to have at the university, and what process do we want to go through to bring that online. And like a lot of things in California and the Bay Area, we've got regulations that govern what we can and cannot do and how we do it. And the decision that was made back then, and it's still the decision we live with today, was to let the regulations dictate. And we have done very little retrofitting of facilities. When I came to Stanford almost 9 years ago, we had 6 stations we had added at that time that were not part of a regulatory requirement. Since that time, we've added over 200. All of them have been in new facilities that were built from the ground up that were required to have chargers as part of it, both installed, ready to go, as well as wired for the future. That we figured out was cheaper than trying to retrofit. Our campus is not new. It's 130 plus years old, which is very old for California. And so there are places in my inventory, I don't have power to bring it there to charge a vehicle. I just have lights. And so the expense of doing that precluded us from retrofitting. So we have focused our attention on new facilities where the cost of the infrastructure is cheaper, where we can finance it with revenue bonds that let it to pay for itself over time. And we've been wedded essentially to ChargePoint that whole time. It's worked out relatively well. And we use them as really a vending machine, frankly. They sell parking time, not power. We cannot sell power. I can't anyway. And that's kind of how we've done it. It's working fairly well, although the folks that would love free charging aren't happy about it. But I don't provide free gasoline, and so I'm not going to provide free electricity. And I get charged for the power. It's not free to me as a consumer of energy at Stanford. So those costs are essentially passed on to the consumers. I don't have any Tesla exclusive chargers. All the chargers I have are ChargePoint, and they are usable by anyone with a ChargePoint account. You don't have to have a Stanford affiliation. And that, again, seems to work. We are getting busier, and we may have to think about expansion, but that'll be a different conversation. To date, focusing on new construction has been the answer, but we struggle with residential. We struggle with it big time because I don't have charging near where a lot of our residence halls are, and we're starting to get students asking to charge, and a trickle charge for them would be fine, but I can't do that. I don't have it set up for that, and they're not very happy about having to use a level 2 when their car sits for weeks at a time. So we struggle with that even to this day.
Okay, Matt, this one's going to you. So you've been in this sector for a long time. What is your experience of the process of due diligence? What needs to happen to get a charger from a thought, from a concept to reality?
Yeah, interesting question. And maybe just to play off what Brian teed up for me, we, in some respects, have the luxury of not starting with an existing portfolio of real estate assets. We don't have buildings that we have to try to figure out how to make it work. We're going out and finding new property that's going to be a really good fit for charging. And it allows us to exclude huge numbers of property opportunities we look at. And we really want to focus in on the best properties. So we actually work with a lot of customers in situations like Brian's where they've got a lot of constraints at their site. They may not be able to get the kind of charging on site that they need, and we're building third-party facilities that are typically near where they need it, but that don't have some of the same constraints. When we think about what we have to find in a piece of property for it to be a great fit, due diligence is a critical piece of that. We've built some of our own analytical tools that take almost 50 different data sets into account to help us weed out those that aren't going to be great and focus in on the best properties. But once we've found that small handful, we do go through a very thorough diligence process to evaluate the sites. By far the most critical element for most all of us in this room today is the availability of power from the utility. That is driving so much of the site selection for us and for others. Because there's such a pressing need from our customers today for charging that we try to find where we've already got good distribution assets and good ability to connect with the grid. But we also recognize that's not going to be enough. And so we're also working with the utilities to develop a longer term plan so that we can do a phase 1 that might bring 2 or 3 megawatts to a site. And then we know we're going to be able to bring a lot more within a 2-year, 3-year time frame. Right. But really getting down to beyond the distribution capacity, what's specific to the site. And I know we've got some experts on the panel today that can talk about what's living underground there, the impact of easements and other things. But making sure, first and foremost, the sites are going to be able to be adequately supplied with power and that they're in really convenient locations for our customer. Those are probably the two most important things that we're focusing on today.
Okay. Access to power, number one. Access to power.
For sure.
I have a little bit subjective opinion on that. I agree with access to power, but in my world, a lot of it has to do with property rights, easements, encumbrances, and how the land is being used, and it has to be correct. But
You may think you have access to power, but until you've done your diligence, you don't really know.
You have to know where you're putting it. And that's one thing all of us had referred to, is that sometimes these sites are so preferable that there's competition amongst vendors to get these sites. It's becoming a very common issue. So John, as far as Matt's reference to underground utilities, you want to speak to that as far as preparing the site to go?
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about a commercial property, there's a lot that goes into the planning and site assessment phase, right? And so when you're looking at, a grocery store that's 3 or 4 acres, you're trying to figure out multiple different things, whether it's, where's the best location for a charger? How much traffic is it going to get? But most importantly, in my world is there any infrastructure in the area that would be a hindrance for the installation in that specific area, right? Where is the closest power supply? Where is the main, infrastructure to the building or buildings on property? And so for us, it's really important that our customers have a really good understanding of what's underground to complement their, survey for their end user, right? So.
All right, sounds good. So another thing we've talked about, and John Duran, this one's for you, is the speed of this industry. I think that the vast majority of us were probably not in this business 10 years ago. Agreed, most of us? So this thing is going at a very, very rapid rate. And ironically, this month, it was 3 years ago that COVID started. So 3 years of that last 10 years, 30% of that time has been in a COVID pandemic environment. So what do you think about the pace of this industry, John?
So if I could, I'd like to ask a question of everybody that's here. How many of you currently already have EV charging at a location that you either own or potentially you rent for if it's a multi-unit dwelling? How many of you already have chargers here? Show of hands. Okay. How many of you are happy with the charging that's going on there right now? Not too bad. So to Russ's point here, if you look back about 10, 11 years ago, EV charging was really something that was on the fringe, right? If people wanted it, it was, yeah, I'll take it because I have to at some point, but I want you to put it in the furthest spot in the lot. And I don't particularly care who parks over there. I don't care if the charger doesn't work. I'm doing it because I have to, and I'm just going to leave it there. Whatever happens, happens. So a lot of times those older chargers, and again, getting back to what we were just talking about a minute ago, they didn't think about the future proofing, right? So what happens in a lot of cases is you go in, it's an older building, you find the panel, you squeeze it in. You throw in two pole 40 amp breakers, you put the charger in, everybody's happy, you walk away. Here we are 10 years later, and EV adoption is starting to accelerate. So now what happens is as you go to these locations, you're going to have to think about a full service. And not just a full service to handle the level 2 chargers. You're going to need 3-phase, 480 power, and you're going to have to start thinking about where are we going to put the DC fast chargers. Do you have the physical space at your property to potentially put in 4, 5, 6 power cabinets and then put in the power posts to be able to charge the vehicles? Are you going to think about, what types of vehicles are going to charge there? Do you potentially want to have spots where vehicles can physically pull through, right? Are you going to have handicap spaces? You see some of these larger vehicles that are out here, some of these vans. You're going to have space for those vans to be able to pull in, allow people to get in and out of them, and then move on. How long are you expecting people to be at these locations? Right? So the industry is moving extremely fast. You have to be prepared. Whether you like it or not, and I'm sure most of the people that are here do, it's coming. So get prepared for when your electrician comes or whoever you get to do the work. that they're going to tell you that this is not going to be a cheap expense. And there's going to be a lot of excavation. Parking lots are going to get ripped up. I say this every single time I talk to people. If you are building a new building, don't think about today, think about 10 years from now. You're going to want to put in oversized conduits, put in extra conduits. You may not need them, you may definitely need them. It is much cheaper to be able to put in the conduits when the ground is ripped up. Because I'm telling you right now, if you've got a beautiful parking lot and you have to go back and rip it up 6 months after you finish it, you're not going to be happy. So just think about that.
Absolutely. So in your reference to your comment about where you're going to be 10 years from now, I think that in the EV world, you can hardly look 10 years ahead. I think you almost have to look 3 years ahead because this is accelerating so fast. So, Brian, do you have a plan for what your world looks like? And how far out is your plan? What does 10 years look like for you? What does 5 years look like for you?
Well, so much of what I have to worry about is determined by the university's development and the regulations we have around that. And that is pretty much in a state of flux right now. COVID has changed quite a bit of the spaces we need and how we want to go about using them. But I look at where is this technology going? I think inductive charging is coming. I think autonomous cars are coming. I can't tell you when, and anybody who does is probably not to be trusted. But they are working on it. It is coming. What I've basically proposed to the university and gotten agreement on is the places that are going to stay the way they are the longest are our garages, because they are the most longer-term invested facilities that we have. The parking lots are the ones that could be converted, taken out of play, invested in different ways, because the cost of that is much less. As demand for driving goes down and people are coming to Stanford in an autonomous electric vehicle, we will convert the garages that are currently using level 2 manually charged facilities into inductive charging locations. And that is not going to be cheap or easy to do, but it's most facilitated in the facilities where I already have the electric infrastructure to charge vehicles. That is probably as close to a 10-year look as I can provide.
Yeah.
But that is all dependent upon where we go with this technology, the regulations, the development, and a lot of the things the earlier panel talked about. In the meantime, as we develop new facilities, they will have to have a minimum number of chargers in them. And if demand increases for electric vehicle charging in my existing facilities, we will partner with a charging provider to add that capacity where I already have it wired and conduit and ready to go. Right. That will be the next, say, 3 to 5 year phase. It's really all dictated not so much by what Stanford wants to do, but by the regulations we have to comply with, but the market. Where's the market going for this? Is it going to be everybody starts buying an EV? Is it the vehicles are going to be autonomous? We don't know that, but we will have to respond to how those market conditions change. Right. And that's why this type of event is important for us to be at, because we need to think about that and be prepared for whatever ultimately comes down the line.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Matt, can you give us an insight into your 5-year business plan?
Yeah, I was going to start with saying, we actually have to look at a 20 to 30-year time horizon
Really?
for a lot of the investments that we're making. Our business is predicated on acquiring, locking up land for the long term. So again, back to that site selection conversation, we have to be very thoughtful about how development is likely to unfold over decades. Now, nobody's crystal ball is perfect, and we'll see what types of transportation will be needed. But one thing we are pretty certain about is there will be a core need to put electricity into vehicles in dense urban areas and in other places that are going to be convenient for transportation. So we can pretty confidently go deep and make those long-term investments. Our initial thought was that we wanted to be developing well ahead of demand in the market. So we were going to go to markets where customers aren't ready today, but would be in the next 2, 3, 4 years. what we're finding is that there's so much pent-up demand from customers that are desperate for charging today that most of our facilities are contracted shortly after we have acquired them. So our longer-term plan is to get ahead of the market again a bit, start making investments in key geographies. You mentioned a little bit about competition in the space.
Yeah.
It's such a big market, and there's so many places where we could be investing. We want to make sure we're making good decisions. But our equity investor, a large private equity group called EQT Partners, they've given us a multi-billion-dollar equity commitment because they see the opportunity to lock up great powered real estate well ahead of the market, and we're leaning heavily into that right now.
All right. It's interesting you go so far out to 20 to 30 years. That's the first time I've heard that. Because I think most of us are intimidated at the pace we're going right now.
And just to add on to that, those of us that have been doing this for 10 or 20 years have seen how much change there has been technologically. We know that that's going to continue. So that's another part of the challenge, is figuring out what combination of assets are going to be at the sites delivering power. Electric vehicles live in very complicated energy environments, and we have on-site generation assets like solar. Energy storage is going to be a big part of this, bidirectional charging. We've got to be thinking about flexibility at these sites so that they'll be viable, again, many years into the future.
All right. It's also, so we've been looking ahead 10 years, and I think it's also interesting to give us a little bit of history. The internal combustion engine has been around for, what do you give me, 150 years? Sound about right? So in 150 years, we're nearing the end of its lifespan, I would presume. That's a little bit presumptuous, but 150 years. So EV has been around for 10 years. Where have you seen it come, John? Where have you seen this 10-year thing come from where we started? And let's say...
Well, if we're going to delve into the world of history, I used to be a history teacher.
Yeah, I know.
Just real quickly, folks, if you didn't already know this, the first fatality between an automobile and a human being was actually an electric car in New York City. Somebody didn't hear the individual coming, stepped off the curb, and got killed by an electric vehicle.
What year?
1896 or thereabouts.
Okay.
So it's been around. We moved away from it because Rockefeller had all the oil.
Right.
But in the past 10 years, you go from just when we installed our first charger 12 years ago, it was the Chevy Volt, and the Leaf was coming, right? And then maybe you had the old Tesla Roadster. But in that 10 years, the sheer number of models and vehicles that are on the road have accelerated. But to a bigger point here, and if you've already talked to me, you may know this, anything that moves humans is going to be electric, all right? There are places where people aren't thinking about that. And I'm not just talking about airplanes, because they're going there, but we're also talking about things like side-by-sides, snowmobiles, obviously motorcycles. People don't think about that. So if you own a ski resort, you've got to start thinking that, hey, I'm going to have to put this infrastructure in, not just in the parking lot for the customers that are coming to ski. I've got to put it in for my snow machines. They're going to be running up and down the hill. So it's accelerated, and it's going to continue to accelerate. A lot of it will be dictated upon whether or not the materials are available to build the vehicles, right? Because there's just so many rare earth metals that we have around, and whether or not the infrastructure is going to be in place. And as much as I hate to say it, it's got to work, all right? Because there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the way the chargers are working now. It's never going to be gas, all right? We can get close, but we'd have to test the laws of physics. But the EV infrastructure has to be in place, and people have to know that when they go to a destination, the chargers are there and they work. And they have to be ubiquitous, and we're not there yet.
Right. That's an interesting point. So the first map I saw of EV charging sites proposed was in late 2012, came from our biggest client, and it was a very interesting map that didn't make any sense to me at all. It had dots all across the continental United States. One of these dots, sidebar story, but one of these dots was in Lusk, Wyoming. So if you've ever been to Lusk, Wyoming, I'm pretty sure that charging site has a horse tied to it, which is poetic in its own way. But this first map was fascinating because it was a geographic spread. it had to be a geographic spread, to your point, John, because you had to get from point A to point B, and however you got there. And I knew, I was smart enough to know that this geographic spread was going to evolve to what? It was going to evolve to a demographic emphasis, right? It had to. So it had to evolve to be where people were. But the first map I have, I've kept it. I should frame it because it was almost pioneering in its essence. But it's been a very interesting process that we've been through, and it has accelerated. So where will we be? I don't know if you all know this, but I believe this conference is being proposed for next year right now. So next year, we're going to be here again, and we're going to go a long way in a year. Do you agree, John?
Yeah, absolutely. And what we've seen the past 3.5 years is, a lot of times the sites were being built in large metroplexes. And with the introduction of NEVI and the IRA, we're seeing the initiative to build projects at rest stops in rural areas, right? And so for GPRS, how we're trying to evolve in the next 2 to 3 to 4 years is just continue to scale with our customers as they have a national presence. We also have a national presence over 104 markets, but we also need to meet that demand because it gets expensive, driving out to Billings, Montana, from Denver or from any other state, Boise. And so we're really just making sure we're scaling with our customers to meet that need and that demand of project flow.
Thank you. So I'm gonna embarrass Matt here a little bit. I stole a quote off of his website, so I'd like you to expand on this, okay?
I'll do my best.
All right. So a key part of the challenge is that charging facilities need to be strategically located, there's your geographic spread, and require a lot of power. In the US and Europe, almost 150 gigawatts of power, about the equivalent to the annual consumption of all US households, will be required by EV fleets by 2030, 7 years from now, 2030. All right, there you go.
All right, well, glad to expand on it. This challenge that's in front of us, it's not even a decade anymore. It's frightening that 2030 is coming so fast. It is one of the challenges of.
Still
Thank you.
challenging.
Go Stanford.
It is certainly one of the biggest challenges that we globally face, as a civilization. Getting through this transition so quickly. The role that we as an industry play in this is we get to sit between these two very powerful forces: the incredible move toward transportation of everything, or electrification of everything in transportation, on the one hand, and the cleaning of the grid on the other. So the source of the energy, getting it into the vehicles. There is a lot of work to do at every stage of that value chain. We absolutely need more renewable energy to come onto the grid. Lots of investment going into that arena. We need to electrify all of our vehicles, and there's a lot of investment going into that world as well. The world that we occupy here, in between those two, is now starting to see the same level of investment that's necessary. So it's going to be a combination of things. One, we need more power. Two, we need to use the power we have more efficiently. And that is by using more technologies on sites, microgrids, V2G, on-site storage, and other things to use, and an intelligent connection to the grid to use the energy we have more effectively. Mm-hmm. And then as an industry, we also have to get more efficient in the way that we use it, both in the vehicles and that we manage it at the sites. So, again, it's an exciting challenge. It is an enormous challenge. And fortunately, the capital markets are now responding, and there are tens of billions of dollars very quickly rushing into the space, alongside huge investments from federal, state, local governments to incentivize this. But I'm really encouraged when I look at all of the people that are here at this event, and so many people that are relatively new to this opportunity. It gives me a lot of confidence that we will have the capability to scale in the way that we have to. But it is an enormous challenge ahead.
All right, thank you, Matt. And so we've been focusing mostly on commercial or institutional applications. John, do you have any thoughts on domestic? Because that's something we've kind of, you're John, Mr. Duran. Do you have any thoughts on domestic? Because I know a lot of people here are interested in domestic applications, kind of the generic thinking that we can all throw a solar panel on our roof and it solves 50% of the problem. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm sure most of you in here know that right now or in the future, 80% of all charging will probably take place at home, right? If we're talking just about electric cars. So people are going to need to have chargers in their homes. And folks that are, own construction companies, they're going to be building massive developments. You're going to have the chargers built into the homes, right? So at a minimum, the way the government is saying that, in the future here, everything is going electric. Get rid of your gas stoves. You're going to have an electric range. You're going to have an electric dryer. So the services inside these houses are going to be much larger because you're probably not going to just have one charger because your wife's going to want to charge or your husband's going to want to charge, and one of the two of you is not going to plug the car in, and somebody's going to be really pissed the next morning. The bottom line is the chargers have to be there. So I think domestically people are going to need to come up with better solutions and ways to figure out how we're going to make this happen. Solar, so on average, I've done the math, and I'm sure there are solar people here who can probably do it better than I. But if you're going to have a level 2 charger running at, just say, 220, and you want to charge at about 20 to 25 miles of range per hour, that panel would have to be 120 feet long by 80 feet wide. So that's a significant amount of solar on the, potentially the roof of your house or so. So it's a lot of power. So in that case, it's going to take other solutions, and people are going to have to be smart. And like you said, V2G, right? People will have an opportunity to do what's called islanding, whether it's their business or their house. They'll put rope CTs around the power coming in, and the charger will communicate basically with the grid. And if something happens, the grid goes down, then you don't have to worry about frying people on the other side of that line. It will send the power directly into the house, and you could potentially have, let's be conservative and say 4 or 5 days worth of power in your vehicle to keep the house running as long as you're conservative about it. So there are my thoughts on domestic.
All right, exciting times. It's kind of what we all started off with in the keynote this morning. We're living in really fast-paced, exciting times. So I think, any other thoughts on your end at the university, Brian, before we throw it to questions?
I think one of the challenges we have in this space is that we're trying to solve for multiple markets with a singular approach.
Okay.
It's not going to work. What I need to do to provide charging for my residents is completely different than one of my colleagues who's here who deals with the fleets. And is completely different from the commuters I mostly deal with and the visitors who come to campus who need to charge their vehicles. We have to start segmenting ourselves into specialties that determine how to solve these problems. And we are trying to retrofit the world that was never built to do this at all. I live in a high-rise building in San Francisco that was opened in 2000. There was no regulations, there was no thoughts, there was no even consideration of the needs for the people that live in that building to charge their vehicles. But at some point, the building becomes unviable and unsellable to future owners if the 75 parking spaces in that building, of which I am an owner of one,
Right.
doesn't have the ability for people to charge their cars. But who pays for that? Does the building pay for that? Does the city of San Francisco pay for that? Does the state of California pay for that? Does the federal government pay for that? Or is it a combination of any and all of that? So we are in a strange position where the world is not set up for charging electric vehicles. It is growingly more and more on new construction, but the retrofit and the needs of residents, domestic use, institutional use, and we haven't talked a lot about fleets. They're all different. And it's going to take a lot of these different folks who deal with these different pieces figuring out together how to solve those problems, or figuring out you got to do it yourself. And that's where I don't think we've really figured this out. And it's not the solutions of the infrastructure providers. The owners of the properties have to get their own act together.
Right. To go to that specific, because a lot of people here come from an urban environment. That's one of the most difficult places to retrofit this, to steal your term. But how do you retrofit an apartment building of 300 units? It doesn't have the footprint space. Literally, how would you hypothetically do that? Because that's a big problem in Portland. It's a big problem in many urban environments.
Yeah, that's. I don't know if there is a solution to that. We are struggling with it on my little building to do that, and we are essentially going to have to wait until some of the issues that we've talked about from a power distribution standpoint and generation standpoint are solved. Even if we decided to spend what it would cost to retrofit our building to charge 75 parking spaces, there's not enough power nearby to do that. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem,
right.
to some degree.
Right.
And we have electric buses at Stanford in large part because we upgraded our electrical infrastructure for other reasons to get off of using gas for heating and cooling buildings. And I could just tap it to charge my buses. So the upgrading of electrical infrastructure, both generation and distribution, is a big part of this discussion. The chargers are just the end state. It's the tap.
Agreed.
But if there's nothing to tap into, I don't care how good your chargers are, you've got to have the power.
Go ahead, Matt.
Can I add just one quick thing to that? Yeah, I like what Brian said about we have to have sort of industry and use case specific companies and people working on those problems. At Volterra, we're bringing also something a little different in that we're also building a horizontal layer underneath all of that. What we're trying to do is bring infrastructure grade capital to help build out a physical layer that all kinds of different applications can be built on. But this fundamental challenge is the hardest piece here. We have to rewire the edge of our grid to be able to handle handle the load, and it doesn't happen until groups like ours, like Brian's and others, make the request to the utilities. So we need to be leaning in now to try to rewire the grid for what it's going to need to do.
Sounds good. John, you had some thoughts on this?
No, what I was going to say is obviously if there's not enough power there, one of the things that we need to discuss is load management software. You've got to be able to throttle back the stations. Again, people have to understand that there are going to be times when you may not be able to get a full charge, all right? Or you may have to, push the charge off to something that's a little bit more essential. Now, if you're talking about buses for transportation systems, those buses have to be charged, and a lot of those transportation systems have to be prepared for emergencies within their own sort of realm, right?
Okay.
So we've talked to the MTA, and one of the things that they're doing with their design is they're putting 350 kW chargers out in the front. So this way, if there's an emergency within the city of New York, the subway's shut down, you can fill in the blanks. Those vehicles roll immediately, and the rest of them can move up and then charge and go. But load management software can help some of the problems that we have in terms of the amount of power that's out there. It's not going to solve all your problems, but it'll certainly help.
So you're asking us to be patient?
Unfortunately, you're going to have to be patient.
Somehow I'm not seeing that. Okay, so we're at time for questions. So, does anybody have any questions? I see one over here. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Deidre Yu. I'm a product manager at a company called FreeWire. So my question is, well, a consistent theme is that power availability is an issue for everyone, right? We can't get chargers installed without power. So have you guys considered bringing battery technology to help supplement so you don't have to wait for the utility to install power, and you can also help with your operating expense, lowering demand charges, things like that? Is this something you've considered?
Okay, so battery technology to supplement, about right? Okay.
I think I have to recuse myself from this one because we already work with FreeWire and we install your stations. So thumbs up.
Go ahead.
Well, I'll tackle this one, and I will say I love FreeWire, and I know Deidre well. Energy storage is going to be a critical piece of the deployments to be able to scale this. I think one of the big questions about storage is always the cost of what it costs to add that to the sites, but it can definitely help accelerate time to power or to a functional site. One of the big questions is, again, back to cost. Is it more cost effective to have larger centralized storage, or to distribute it at the charger level.
Right.
Every site's going to be different. It's going to have different needs. In our world, where we're doing very, very large deployments, 10 megawatts and higher, typically it's going to be a more centralized approach. But for a lot of other smaller applications, I think that distributed approach is going to be perfect.
Great. I love that question. I love the whole process of pushing back to what exists. I love it. That's great. Okay, anybody else? All right. This young man right here.
Hi, Peter from Shoals. I have a question for John. So you've been highly impactful in... Closer? Closer? Right there?
There you go.
There we go. You've been highly impactful in the New York State installations and the growth of charging networks there. I'm mainly wondering about, like, as the installer, site designer, turnkey provider, how do you balance, you know, your relationships with site owners that have high expectations of uptime, have high expectations of site design, and, you know, no disturbance of traffic, with relationships with OEMs and vendors that they just want their chargers in the ground, right? We can talk all day about numbers of chargers in the ground, but it comes down to, does the site work? And that seems to be something you've figured out.
Yeah, and I would say that some of the OEMs are probably going to get angry at my response to this, but the bottom line is, if there are going to be service providers out there, those service providers need to be able to get to the back end on a lot of the stations so they can see what's going on and potentially troubleshoot at home, rather than having to go through another provider and maybe even 2 steps before they get to figure out what's going on. That's a huge piece of it. The other part is, at this point, because the infrastructure is so small, and it really is in a relative sense, much huger than it was, but still relatively small, it's sort of easier to be able to dispatch somebody, but you have to set SLAs up so that there are levels within those SLAs of what is most important, right? Is it the holder for the CHAdeMO's got a crack in it? Okay, we'll get to it when we get to it. Or is the station on fire and there are 30 people with their hair on fire running away from it and everybody's freaking out? We need to be there in 2 seconds. So, and there's some levels in between all of that. All of that needs to be managed, but getting to that back end on those stations makes it a lot easier to understand what the actual problem is. And if you spend enough time doing that, it's easy to figure out, is it a small 24 volt issue that maybe the ARM-XL board is not getting the power that it needs to, or something else, right? Or is it something more major that we need to go after? Are there fuses that are blowing? Over time, if you look at all those items as they come in, you start to get a better feel for what's going on, which makes it much easier for us to look at that and be able to put the parts in place so that they can now be dispatched and get those parts in those stations to keep them up and running. And folks, just real quickly, this whole concept of uptime, I know people love to say that. Uptime means literally nothing to me, okay? It's great. The station communicates. What I want to know is that station dispensing, right? That's the most important piece. It can be up, but is it dispensing? So that's just something that's really important to us, to make sure that when people are pulling up to those stations, they can feel confident that they're going to plug it in, and barring any operator error, they're going to get a charge and move on to their next destination.
Okay.
That help?
All right, thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jeremiah Hartley. I'm with Portland International Airport. Question's kind of directed to John and Brian, but anybody jump in.
Hold the mic up just a bit so we can hear
Oh,
you.
is it still?
There you
Okay.
go.
Jeremiah Hartley from Portland International Airport. Directed more towards John and Brian, but in your experiences of, install facilities at Stanford and with you in planning for JFK, did you have adequate access to power going into this, or was there any kind of creative engineering that you had to do in order to achieve your ends?
I think I mentioned that the university went through a major energy distribution and development process that we've been fortunate just to tap into that. So the university invested millions of dollars in essentially electrifying most of its energy needs and new distribution processes and bringing more power to the campus, and invested in solar farms in other parts of the state and getting those RECs back into the system so that when I need to electrify a new garage, or add electric charging for my buses, the power is not too far away to get. and it's new power in terms of the infrastructure I'm tapping into. There's always the switchgear and the transformers, depending upon what you're doing. But because of other investments the university has made, it's made it easier and cheaper for me to expand charging as needed at Stanford. That's why I get back to the need for the power to be generated and distributed where you're going to need it. If you don't have that, the cost and the complexities involved in getting that power just multiply and is really more exponential. So we have been fortunate by good decisions that the university had previously made.
Thanks, Brian. There's a question over here.
Hi, Jos Gobel with Volley Automation. We do automated parking garages. What kind of benefit could you guys see if we were doing higher utilization of charging infrastructure, especially like overnight parking? If you had an automated system to basically act like a valet to move charged cars out of charging spots and put new ones in. Do you guys would see that as a benefit for what you're doing?
Go ahead, Matt.
I think I got the question.
Yeah, it's a little hard to hear up here.
One of the key things that we should all be thinking about with regard to the charging installations that we're developing is utilization. The higher utilization we have, the more power we dispense, the lower the cost is for the driver, for the real estate owner. So we should always be looking for that. So solutions like you've described that are helping increase the density, the utilization, those are certainly solutions that we should be talking about as an industry, especially when it comes to dense urban areas where it's a real problem.
All right. Did that cover your question? Okay, thank you. Anybody else? We're running out of time here. Okay. Okay, then we are good to go. Thank you very much for entertaining us. No, thank you for participating. We appreciate it.